Emily Harper pressed 3 stolen eggs against her chest like they were her children, because they were all she had left in this world. Her boots were falling apart. Her dress was soaked through. And somewhere behind her, in those Colorado hills, men with rifles and legal papers were coming to collect what they said she owed. She didn't hear him until he was already standing between her and the tree line. A mountain cowboy, silent as stone. Eyes like cold iron. "You steal from me," he said quietly, "or you run from somebody else." If this story already has your heart racing, hit subscribe and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Emily Harper had been running for 11 days. She knew the exact number because she had counted every sunrise like a woman counting the last coins in an empty purse, desperate, deliberate, terrified of reaching zero. 11 days since the men from Hargrove Lending came to the ranch outside Denver with their papers and their smiles and their certainty that she had nowhere to go. 11 days since she had grabbed her mother's wool coat off the hook by the door and run into the dark without looking back. She was 23 years old, and she had never felt older. The Colorado high country in July should have been kind. People back east imagined it that way. Wildflowers, clean air, the romantic notion of frontier freedom. What they did not imagine was the way the altitude thinned your breath until every uphill step felt like breathing through wet cloth. They did not imagine blisters that opened and bled and opened again. They did not imagine what hunger actually felt like after 3 days. Not the polite discomfort of a skipped meal, but a hollowness that started eating your thoughts from the inside out, making you stupid and slow and mean. Emily had been living on creek water and determination for the better part of a week. And then she smelled wood smoke. She followed it like a starving animal follows any scent that promises survival. Her boots stumbling over loose rock and dry summer grass. She came through a stand of pines and stopped at the edge of a property she recognized instantly as someone's livelihood, a cabin, a fence line, a small outbuilding, and tucked behind it a chicken coop. Her stomach made a sound that would have embarrassed her 6 months ago. She told herself she would only take 2. She told herself she would leave something in trade, though she had nothing to leave. She told herself a great many things as she moved through the shadows toward that coop, her hands already shaking with a hunger that had long since overruled her conscience. She got 3 eggs into her hands before the voice hit her like a bucket of cold water. "I'd stop right there if I were you." Emily spun. He was standing at the corner of the outbuilding, one shoulder leaned against the wood like he had been there a while, like he had watched her cross his property and decide to steal from him and had simply waited to see how far she'd take it. He was tall, not the theatrical height of a man who knows he's imposing, but the practical height of someone built for hard country, broad through the shoulder, lean everywhere else. His hat was pushed back enough that she could see his face clearly in the morning light. He looked about 34, maybe older. It was hard to tell with men who lived like this, the sun and the work, aged some of them fast, and carved others into something that looked almost permanent, like rock formations. His jaw was heavy with several days of dark stubble. His eyes were a shade of gray that reminded her absurdly of the sky before a storm decides what it's going to do. He was not pointing a weapon at her. That she decided was either a very good sign or a very bad one. She started. "Don't," he said. Not unkindly, just final. He pushed off the wall and walked toward her with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to rush toward anything. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at her. Really looked the way people rarely bothered to look at women in her situation, like he was actually trying to understand something rather than simply assess the problem. Whatever he saw made something shift behind his eyes. She couldn't name it. She was too hungry and too tired and too frightened to name much of anything just then. "How long since you ate?" he asked. The question caught her so completely off guard that she almost told him the truth before her defenses snapped back into place. "That's not your concern," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that at least. "You're standing on my property holding my eggs," he said. "Makes it my concern." "I was going to leave something in trade. You got nothing to leave." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation delivered the same way he might note the weather. I watched you cross from the tree line. Coat's 2 big boots are done. You've got no pack, no horse, no weapon. He paused. And you're listing a little to the left, which means either you twisted something, or you've been walking so long your body's starting to quit on you. Emily straightened instinctively. His mouth didn't quite do anything that could be called a smile, but something changed at the corners. Doesn't help if you're actually hurt, he said. I'm fine. You're not fine. He said it without cruelty, but without softness either. Just the flat authority of a man who had seen enough damaged things to know what they looked like. Come inside. She stared at him. I don't know you. Dawson Cole, he said. I own this valley. Now you know me. He turned and walked toward the cabin without looking back, like the matter was decided. Emily stood there in the summer heat, 3 stolen eggs in her hands, watching a stranger walk away from her, like he had just offered her the most ordinary thing in the world, instead of the only kindness anyone had shown her in 11 days. Her legs made the decision before her head did. She followed him. The inside of the cabin was spare and ordered in a way that told her more about Dawson Cole than any introduction could. Everything had a place. Everything was where it belonged. There was no excess, no decoration, no sentiment visible on the surfaces, but there was quality in what remained, the kind that came from choosing things that lasted rather than things that impressed. A wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, shelves of provisions organized with military precision, a rifle on the wall within reach of the door. He set a cast-iron pan on the stove without asking her anything. Emily stood inside the doorway and tried to decide whether she was more afraid of him or of walking back out into those hills. It was closer than she liked to admit. Sit down, he said. You're making me tired watching you stand there deciding things. I haven't decided anything. You're still inside, he said. That's a decision. She sat. He cracked her stolen eggs into the pan, all 3 of them, and added something from a tin without ceremony. The smell hit her so hard she had to grip the edge of the table. You running from a husband? He asked. His back was to her. No. Law? No. She hesitated. Not exactly. He glanced back at that, just once. Debt men, she said. From Denver. Hargrove Lending. She watched his face for recognition, for the subtle flinch that meant he'd heard the name, and it meant something. She got it brief, controlled, but there. You know them. I know of them, he said. Most people in this territory do one way or another. He turned back to the stove. They got paper on you. They say they do. They say my father borrowed against the ranch and died without settling it, and now the debt transfers. She heard the flatness in her own voice, the flatness of someone who had explained this injustice so many times. It had stopped making her angry and started making her tired. It's not legal, not really. But they've got a marshal in their pocket and nobody in Denver who'll hear otherwise. So you ran. I ran. He set the plate in front of her. Emily looked at the eggs and then up at him, and she had just enough dignity left to say, I'll pay you back. When I can. I swear it. Dawson sat down across from her and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove. He set one in front of her. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said very simply, Eat first. Then we'll talk about what comes next. She ate. She hadn't cried in 11 days. She had considered it a kind of discipline that if she started she wouldn't stop, and she couldn't afford to stop. But sitting at a stranger's table in the Colorado high country in the middle of July with a hot meal and a cup of coffee in front of her, something in her chest cracked open just slightly, just enough that she had to look down at her plate and breathe through it carefully. Dawson Cole said nothing. He drank his coffee and watched out the window and gave her the dignity of pretending he hadn't noticed. She liked him for that despite herself. She told him the rest of it while the morning moved toward noon. Not everything. There were things she kept close, things that still felt too raw to hand to a stranger, but enough. The ranch outside Denver that her father had built over years. The loan he'd taken when the drought hit, the one he'd never told her about, because he was a proud man who didn't want his daughter to know how close to the edge they were. His death in March, quiet and sudden, a heart that had been working too hard for too long, finally stopping in the night. And then Hargrove's men at the door, within 2 weeks, holding paper that said the ranch and everything on it now belonged to them and Emily, with it not in writing, not in any language that would hold up before an honest judge, but in practice, in the way they spoke to her, in the way the marshal nodded along when they explained the arrangement. Work off the debt, they said. Cooking and cleaning and whatever else was required in their operation up in the mountains. She had understood immediately what whatever else meant. She had left that same night. Dawson listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his coffee cup still in his hand, looking at the table. "This marshal," he said. "His name, Elias Cord." Emily looked up sharply. "You know him. He's been working for Hargrove 2, maybe 3 years. Comes through this valley twice a season, sniffing around water rights and property lines." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, but something older and more patient than anger. "He came to me twice about selling Bear Creek." "What did you say?" "What I always say to men like that." His jaw tightened slightly. "No." She studied him. "They'll come here," she said. "If they track me, and they will track me, they're thorough. They'll come to every property in this range asking questions. And if they find me here, then they find you here," he said. "That's not you don't understand what they're capable of, Miss Harper." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her the way a hand on the shoulder stops a person. "I've been in this valley for 8 years. I was a Union scout before that. I have some passing familiarity with what men are capable of." He set down his coffee cup. "I'm not afraid of Hargrove's collectors." "You should be. There are a lot of them." "There are a lot of rocks on that mountain too," he said. "Doesn't mean I lose sleep over it." Emily stared at him. There was something almost maddening about his steadiness, the way nothing she said seemed to land with the appropriate weight of alarm, like she was describing a rainstorm to a man who had spent his whole life standing in weather. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment before answering. "Because you were hungry," he said, "and because 3 eggs wasn't worth letting a person starve over." He stood and carried his cup to the wash basin. "You can stay in the loft tonight. There's a spare blanket in the chest. And tomorrow—" He paused with his back to her. "Tomorrow we figure out what next looks like," he said. "One thing at a time." She slept for 14 hours. She didn't mean to. She had intended to rest for an hour, maybe 2, to let her body stop screaming long enough for her mind to make a plan. But the loft was warm in the summer afternoon heat, and the blanket smelled like cedar and wood smoke, and her body apparently had opinions that overruled her entirely. When she woke, it was dark outside, and there was the smell of something cooking below. She lay still for a moment and listened to the sounds of the cabin, the soft sounds of a man moving through a space he knew completely, the clink of a spoon against a pot, the occasional creak of the floorboards. Nothing alarmed, nothing urgent. Just the ordinary sounds of someone going about the evening without crisis. And she had forgotten, she realized, how much of her life had been ordinary before March. How much she had taken for granted the simple absence of fear. She climbed down from the loft. Dawson was at the stove. He didn't turn around immediately, just said, "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. Supper's about 10 minutes. "How long was I asleep?" "Long enough," he said. Which told her nothing, and also everything. She washed her face and her hands, and sat back down at the table. He set a bowl of stew in front of her, real stew, with meat and vegetables, the kind of meal that required actual intention and planning, and sat across from her with his own. They ate in silence for a while. It was not uncomfortable silence. That surprised her. "I need to figure out where to go," she said eventually. "I can't stay here and put you in." "There's something I want to say to you," Dawson interrupted. He set down his spoon. "And I want you to hear it out before you answer." She stopped. He looked at her directly in that unhurried way of his. Hargrove's been trying to get Bear Creek for 2 years, he said. The reason they want it is the water rights. This creek feeds 4 ranches below the valley, and whoever controls the source controls a great deal more than just one property. He paused. If they can attach a legal claim to this land, any claim, even a thin one, they can drag it into territorial court, and Cord has enough judges there to make anything stick. Emily set down her own spoon slowly. What kind of claim are you talking about? A marriage claim, he said. If you are my legal wife, your debt transfers to me. But I'm not in debt to Hargrove. I have clear title to this land going back to federal land grant. A wife's debts become the husband's. A husband's legal standing protects both. He held her gaze steadily. Hargrove can't take what belongs to a married woman's husband when the husband has clean paper on everything he owns. The silence stretched. Emily heard everything he was saying. She also heard everything he was not saying, that this was not a declaration, not a romantic gesture, not anything warm or dishonest. It was a man with a legal mind and a practical problem sitting across a table from a woman with a different practical problem, and examining whether the two problems might solve each other. You're asking me to marry you, she said carefully. A man I met this morning. I'm asking if you'd consider it, he said, as a legal arrangement to protect you from Hargrove's paper, and to remove the pretext they need to come at my land. He didn't look away. You'd have the loft, your own space. Work here is honest. I won't pretend there isn't work this place runs on it, but it's yours to do on your own terms. You wouldn't owe me anything beyond what the law requires on paper. Emily looked at him for a long moment. And if I say no, she asked. Then I put you on my horse tomorrow and take you to the stage road, he said. Give you money enough to get to Pueblo, and I hope you're faster than Hargrove's men. That's my only other option. That I can see, he said. You might see others, you're not stupid. She almost laughed at that. It came out of her as a sound she hadn't expected, brief and startled, and Dawson's eyes shifted fractionally, something flickering in them for just a moment before settling back into their usual patience. You don't know me, she said. No, he agreed. But I know Hargrove, and I know Cord, and I know what happens to women who end up owing men like that with no one to stand between. He picked up his spoon again. You don't have to decide tonight. Emily looked down at her stew. She thought about the ranch her father had built. She thought about the men who had come to the door with their papers and their certainty. She thought about 11 days and 3 stolen eggs, and a stranger who had watched her cross his property and steal from him and chosen to feed her anyway. She thought about the way he had given her the dignity of not watching her cry. I have conditions, she said quietly. He looked up. The loft stays mine, she said. And I want it on paper that this arrangement can be dissolved legally when the threat from Hargrove is settled if I choose it. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. And I want to know everything, she said. Every piece of what they're doing to this valley, every legal angle you know about, every contact you have. If I'm going to be part of this, even on paper, I want to understand what I'm part of. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded. Agreed, he said again. Emily picked up her spoon. All right, she said. Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the supper. But when she climbed back to the loft that night, Emily Harper realized she had stopped listening for footsteps behind her for the first time in 11 days. She didn't know yet what that meant. She suspected in the complicated and cautious architecture of her heart that she was afraid to find out. The morning after Emily Harper agreed to become Dawson Cole's wife on paper, she woke before sunrise and lay in the loft listening to him already moving around below. That was the first thing she learned about him. He didn't sleep late. She wasn't sure he slept much at all. She heard the stove door open, the careful sound of someone adding wood without wanting to wake another person. She heard boots cross the floor with a deliberateness that was almost considerate, a big man making himself quiet in his own home because someone else was in it. She stared at the ceiling and thought about what she had agreed to. In the gray logic of morning without hunger, clouding everything, without exhaustion, making every option look equally desperate, and threw it again. The legal framework was sound. She had enough of her father's practical intelligence to understand the argument Dawson had made. A wife's debts transferred to the husband. A husband with clear federal land title and no outstanding obligations to Hargrove Lending was a wall they couldn't climb with paperwork alone. It made sense. It was defensible. It was also the most insane thing she had ever agreed to. She climbed down from the loft. Dawson was at the stove. He glanced back at her, once registered that she was upright and apparently not in the process of changing her mind, and turned back to whatever was in the pan. "Coffee's ready?" he said. "Thank you," she said. They ate breakfast with the same careful quiet they'd managed the night before. Emily kept waiting for something to feel wrong, for him to say something that revealed a calculation she'd missed, an angle she hadn't seen. She was watching for it the way you watched a card player's hands looking for the tell. He didn't give her one. "I need to ride into Cutter's Bend today," he said when the plates were cleared. "There's a justice of the peace there, man named Aldous Webb. He's straight been here longer than Hargrove's money, and he's not impressed by it." He looked at her across the table. "If you're still in agreement, we can make it legal this morning." Emily set down her coffee cup. "That fast? The faster the better," he said. "Hargrove's men don't drag their feet. If they tracked you to this range, they'll be asking questions in Cutter's Bend inside of 2 days." He paused. "Once there's a marriage record with Webb's seal on it, the debt claim has nowhere to land. That's the window." She understood the logic. She also understood that the moment she walked into that office and said yes in front of a witness, the door behind her closed on a particular kind of life. The one where she was still technically free to simply be Emily Harper with no attachments and no arrangements. She wasn't sure that life had been going so well for her lately. "All right," she said, "let's go." Something in his posture shifted. Not relaxation exactly. More like a man who had braced for resistance and was recalibrating. "I'll saddle the horse," he said. "Dawson." She said his name for the first time, and he stopped at the door. She wasn't sure why she'd said it, only that she needed him to look at her directly for a moment. He did. "If this goes wrong," she said, "if Webb talks or someone sees us or Hargrove moves faster than you expect, I need to know you have a plan past the paperwork." He held her gaze. "I always have a plan past the paperwork," he said. Then he went to saddle the horse. Emily stood in the cabin alone for 30 seconds and made herself breathe evenly. Then she went and straightened her dress, put on her mother's coat, despite the summer heat, because it was the only thing she owned, and walked out to meet whatever came next. Cutter's Bend was a town the size of an argument, long enough to have a saloon, a dry goods store, a livery, and a post office, short enough that everyone in it knew everyone else's business within the hour. Emily felt the looks the moment they rode in Dawson's horse carrying them both, because she had nothing to ride. She felt him register the looks too. His posture didn't change, but something in the set of his jaw did very slightly, like a man deciding in advance that he was not going to react to anything small. Aldous Webb's office was between the post office and a building that might have been a doctor's practice. Webb himself was a compact white-haired man of about 60, who looked at Dawson with the recognition of long acquaintance, and at Emily with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to ask too many questions about frontier arrangements. "Dawson," he said. "Aldous." Dawson took off his hat. "We need a marriage recorded. Today." Webb looked at Emily. "Miss Harper," she said. "Emily Harper." "You're here of your own will, Miss Harper." "I am," she said. Something passed across Webb's face, not suspicion, but the particular attentiveness of a man taking a measurement. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded, opened his ledger, and picked up his pen. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to do something that could not be undone without a different set of papers, and a judge who was neither in Hargrove's pocket nor Webb's age, and very possibly not available in any territory she'd ever stand in. When Webb stamped the seal and handed Dawson the copy, Dawson folded it once and put it inside his vest without ceremony. "Congratulations," Webb said. He said it the way a man says words he knows are approximately correct without being entirely sure of the context. Then he looked at Emily again, with that measuring look. "You need anything else, Miss Harper? Mrs. Cole, you come find me. Doesn't matter the hour." Emily understood what he was offering. A door left slightly open. A lifeline in case the door she'd just walked through turned out to be wrong. "Thank you, Mr. Webb," she said. "I'll remember that." They walked out into the summer heat, and Emily had to stop on the step for just a moment because the air felt different than it had going in, and she needed a second to determine whether that was good or terrifying. "You all right?" Dawson said. Quietly, so only she heard. "Ask me in a week," she said. He almost did the thing that wasn't quite a smile. "Fair enough," he said. They were turning toward the horse when the voice came from across the street. "Well now, Dawson Cole." The voice was the kind that had learned to carry loud enough to stop people positioned to be public. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." Emily turned. The man crossing the street toward them wore a badge. He was perhaps 45, with the particular build of someone who had once been physically capable and had since let the authority of his position substitute for the maintenance of it. He had the eyes of a man who was accustomed to people looking away first. Marshal Elias Cord. Emily felt the recognition go through her like cold water. She had never seen him in person, but she had heard him described clearly enough by the women in Denver who knew what Hargrove's network looked like from the inside. She kept her face completely still. Dawson stepped forward once, not in front of her exactly, but between her and Cord's direct sightline, just slightly, just enough. "Marshal," he said. His voice was the same as it always was. That was the thing about Dawson Cole that Emily was beginning to understand. He had one voice. It didn't change for weather or company. Cord's eyes moved to Emily. She watched him process her, the too large coat, the worn boots, the way she was standing next to a man who had just come out of a justice of the peace's office. She watched him add things up. "Don't believe I know your companion," Cord said. "My wife," Dawson said. The word landed in the air between the three of them, like a stone into still water. Emily watched Cord's face do something complicated and quick behind his eyes before settling back into its performed sociability. "That right," Cord said. It was not a question. "Just recorded with Webb," Dawson said. "You're welcome to verify." A beat. A very controlled, very deliberate beat, in which Emily did not move, did not breathe differently, did not give Cord anything to work with. "Huh," Cord said finally. He looked at Emily with a smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "Congratulations, ma'am." "Thank you, Marshal," Emily said. Another beat. Then Cord tipped his hat, the gesture of a man performing politeness while his mind worked in a completely different direction, and walked on down the street. Dawson didn't watch him go. He moved to the horse and offered Emily a hand up with the same practical matter-of-factness he'd offered her the eggs that morning, which was so consistent with everything she was coming to understand about him that she almost found it funny. She took his hand and swung up. "He's going to telegraph Hargrove within the hour," she said quietly, as Dawson settled behind her and turned the horse. "I know," he said. "So what happens next?" "Next," he said, "we go home and I show you the land boundaries, because you need to understand what we're protecting and why before they make their next move." Emily noted the we. She didn't say anything about it, but she noted it. Back at Bear Creek, Dawson spread a map across the table that had clearly been drawn by hand over several years, updated, corrected, annotated in a small, precise script that told her he had been watching this territory long before she arrived in it. He walked her through it without preamble. Bear Creek ran from a high country source down through his valley and fed into a network of 3 other properties below. The water rights were tied to his federal land grant. Anyone who controlled the creek's source controlled the water supply for the entire lower range during dry months, which in the Colorado high country meant approximately 5 months of the year. "Hargrove wants to run a railroad spur through this valley," Dawson said, his finger tracing a line on the map. They've been buying up water rights all along the proposed route. Every property that agrees to sell or gets pressured into agreements they don't understand gives them more legal surface to work with when they file with the territorial government. And the ones who don't agree, Emily said, get visited by Cord, he said, who finds problems with their title or their fencing or their grazing boundaries. Small things. Things that can be challenged in court. He straightened. Court costs money. Most ranchers out here don't have it. Most of them settle. But you haven't. I have clear title going back to the original federal grant, he said. There's nothing for Cord to challenge, which means Hargrove needs a different way in. Emily looked at the map. The debt claim, she said. If I were legally attached to this property, they'd argue the debt was a lien, he said. That your father's obligation attached to any assets you held, including interest in property through marriage. It's thin. It wouldn't survive a federal court challenge. He paused. But it would buy them enough time in territorial court to tie up the title, during which time they could move on the creek, legally file their own claim, and establish enough presence that by the time a federal ruling came through, they'd have infrastructure in place that would cost more to remove than to simply allow. Emily stood with this for a moment. She had known she was being used as a legal instrument. She had understood that much from the beginning. But the full scope of it, the careful architecture of it, settled into her now with a weight that was different from the simple desperation of the past 11 days. She had been a piece in a much larger game, and she hadn't even known the board existed. How long have you known all this? She asked. Long enough, he said. That's not an answer. He looked at her. About 18 months, he said. Since the second time Cord came to ask about the creek. I hired a lawyer in Denver to look into Hargrove's broader operations. Something shifted in his expression. He found your father's property on the list of recent acquisitions. Emily went very still. You knew about my father. I knew a ranch outside Denver had been added to Hargrove's ledger, he said carefully. I didn't know you. I didn't know the details. He held her gaze. When you walked out of my tree line yesterday morning, I didn't know who you were until you told me. She believed him. She wasn't sure why. She had been given many reasons in the past several months not to believe men who said careful, measured things. But Dawson Cole had not so far offered her anything she hadn't been able to verify for herself, and his accounting of his own position was consistent in a way that manipulation rarely managed to be. All right, she said. She looked back at the map. So Cord telegraphs Hargrove today. Hargrove finds out the debt claim has no legal surface anymore because I'm married to you. What do they do next? Dawson crossed his arms and looked at the map with her. They have two options, he said. Challenge the marriage in court, argue it was contracted under duress, or that it's fraudulent, or they move to Plan 2, which is direct pressure on the property itself. Meaning men with guns. Meaning men with guns, he said. Dressed up as one thing or another. Cord can deputize people, which gives them legal cover. Or they send private contractors and let Cord look the other way. He unfolded his arms. Either way, they'll move fast. They've been building toward this valley for too long to let paperwork slow them down indefinitely. Emily thought about the map. She thought about the creek. She thought about her father, who had never told her how close to the edge they were because he was a proud man who believed he could carry things alone. She thought about how that had worked out for him. Then we need to be faster, she said. Dawson looked at her. You said you have a lawyer in Denver, she said. Can he file with the federal land office? Get a federal review of Hargrove's entire acquisition pattern in this territory, not just the claim against me. He was quiet for a moment. That's a larger action than I've moved to take yet, he said. Because once you file federally, you're committing to a fight that doesn't stay quiet, he said. It draws attention, other attention. People who want Hargrove stopped for reasons of their own, which means entering alliances with parties whose motives you don't fully control. Versus waiting for men with guns to come to your valley, Emily said, which also doesn't stay quiet. Another silence, longer this time. You think fast for someone who spent 11 days running through mountains, he said. I spent 11 days thinking, she said. Running is mostly thinking. There's not much else to do. He studied her for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and moved to the shelf where he kept his correspondence materials. I'll write to McAllister, my lawyer, today, he said. If he can get a federal filing initiated within the week, we may be able to stay ahead of whatever Cord puts in motion. Good, she said. He dipped his pen. Then he paused without looking up. Emily. She was nearly to the ladder. She stopped. You're not just a piece of paper in this, he said. His voice was level, but something in it was different from his usual flat precision. I want that said plainly. She stood on the bottom rung of the ladder and considered him this man she had known for one full day, who had fed her and married her, and showed her his maps and his strategy and his correspondence without hesitation, who was now telling her something that she could not quite categorize. Noted, she said. She climbed up to the loft. Below her she heard the scratch of his pen beginning to move. She lay back and stared at the ceiling in the afternoon heat, and listened to the careful, determined sound of him writing, and thought that she was either the luckiest woman in the Colorado Territory or the most reckless. She fell asleep before she could decide which. She woke to the sound of horses. Not one. Several. She came off the loft ladder fast, and her feet hit the floor just as Dawson crossed to the window. His rifle was already in his hand, not aimed, just carried the way a man carries an umbrella when the sky looks uncertain. Emily moved to the other side of the window and looked. 3 riders, stopping in the yard. They were not Cord's men, not in uniform, no badges visible. But they had the particular quality of men who were used to arriving places and having the arrival itself be enough of a statement. The one in front was perhaps 50, with a suit that was too good for backcountry riding, and the expression of a man who had stopped being troubled by other people's discomfort sometime in the distant past. Emily had never seen him before, but she knew who he was. She knew it the way you know a thing you have been afraid of before you can put a name to it. Dawson stepped out onto the porch. Emily followed without thinking, stepping up beside him, before she consciously decided to, and she felt him register her presence with a fractional shift of his weight. The man in the suit looked at her, then at Dawson, then back at her with an expression that was not quite a smile. "Mrs. Cole," he said. He had a voice like expensive leather, smooth and impossible to get a grip on. "I don't believe we've been introduced. My name is Gerald Hargrove." The air in the yard went completely still. Emily felt the whole weight of the past 11 days, every step, every Cold Creek crossing, every night without shelter, every stolen egg, every calculated decision she'd made in the past 36 hours, converge into this moment, this yard, this man sitting on a horse, looking at her like she was a problem he had already begun solving. Beside her, Dawson said nothing. He didn't need to. He was just standing there, rifle at his side, between her and the man who had come to take everything, and the simple absolute fact of him standing there was the loudest thing in the yard. Hargrove's eyes moved to Dawson. "We should talk," Hargrove said, "like reasonable men." "You rode 3 hours into my valley," Dawson said. "Talk." Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had more patience than everyone else in the conversation, and who had been right about that often enough to mistake it for a permanent condition. "The girl is resourceful," he said. "I'll grant her that. But what's been recorded at Webb's office this morning doesn't change the underlying obligation. Courts take time, Mr. Cole. And time," his gaze moved slowly, deliberately around the yard, "has a way of being expensive out here." Emily felt Dawson move beside her, not toward Hargrove, just a shift of his weight forward, almost imperceptibly, the way a wall shifts when something leans into it. "You threatening my property?" Dawson said. "I'm describing the nature of legal proceedings," Hargrove said pleasantly. "Nothing more." "Then we understand each other," Dawson said. You've described your position. I've heard it. Now I'm going to describe mine." He looked at Hargrove with those gray eyes that didn't change for weather or company or men in expensive suits on expensive horses. "This valley has a federal land grant from 1867. Clear title, no encumbrance. Any legal action you bring against it will be reviewed by the Federal Land Office, which means it goes above court's jurisdiction and above every territorial judge you've paid for." He paused. "I filed that paperwork this morning, before we rode to Webb's." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than had existed before it. Emily looked at Dawson. He had not told her that. He had ridden to Cutter's Bend, married her in front of Webb, walked out to face court in the street, and at some point in those 11 minutes of ceremony, he had also filed a federal review with the land office. She had told him that morning to think past the paperwork. He had already been there. Hargrove's pleasant expression did not disappear, but something behind it did. "You've been busy," Hargrove said. "I've been prepared," Dawson said. "There's a difference." Hargrove looked at Emily one more time. It was a different look than before, not the assessment of a problem to be solved, but the recognition of a miscalculation. She held his gaze without blinking. "Good day, Mrs. Cole," he said. He turned his horse. His men turned with him. They rode out of the yard without hurry, because men like Hargrove never hurried, because hurrying would mean admitting that something had not gone according to plan. Emily waited until the sound of hoofbeats had fully faded. Then she turned to Dawson. "You filed before the wedding," she said. "Had to," he said. Webb notarized both documents. Marriage record and the federal filing both carry his seal and today's date. He finally lowered the rifle to his side. If Hargrove challenges the marriage in territorial court, the federal filing is already in the record ahead of it. Emily stared at him. "You planned all of this," she said. "Before I even agreed." "I planned the option," he said. "You agreed. Those are different things." He looked at her steadily. "I wasn't going to file unless you said yes." She believed him about that too. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with a man she kept believing. It was a sensation she had not experienced recently enough to be comfortable with it. She looked out at the empty yard where Hargrove had been. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes," Dawson said. "With more than 3 men." "Yes." "And Cord." "Almost certainly." She nodded slowly. The fear was there. She wasn't pretending otherwise. She had learned that pretending otherwise was a luxury that people who had better options could afford. But beneath the fear was something else now, something that had been absent for 11 days, and that she was only beginning to recognize. She was not alone in this yard. She was not alone. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. Dawson looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside. I'll show you where I keep the ammunition." Emily followed him in. And for the second time in 2 days, without quite meaning to, she left fear standing outside and walked through a door toward something she hadn't had in a very long time. Something that felt cautiously and against all evidence of recent experience like solid ground. Hargrove rode out of the yard like a man who had simply decided the conversation was over, and that was what kept Emily awake that night. Not the threat, not the guns his men carried, or the money behind him, or the judges Dawson said he owned. Those things were frightening in a straightforward way that she could measure and plan against. What kept her awake was the patience in Hargrove's voice when he said good day. The way he'd looked at her like she was an equation he hadn't finished solving yet. Men who lost their temper when a plan went sideways were predictable. Men who smiled and rode away were something else entirely. She was still thinking about it when she heard Dawson's boots on the floor below her at 4 a.m. She climbed down. He was at the table with the map and 3 letters he hadn't shown her before. He didn't look surprised to see her. He just moved one of the letters so she could see it from where she stood. "McAllister sent this 2 weeks ago," he said. "I didn't show you because you weren't here 2 weeks ago, but you should read it now." Emily sat and read. The letter was precise and lawyerly, and by the 3rd paragraph her hands were not entirely steady. McAllister had tracked Hargrove's acquisitions across 4 territories, 17 properties in the past 3 years. In 11 of them, the original owner had ended up either selling at a catastrophic loss under legal pressure, or simply disappearing from the records altogether, no forwarding deed, no sale recorded, nothing. Just a name that stopped appearing in county filings. 11 people who had stood between Hargrove and what he wanted. 11 people who had simply ceased to be a legal presence. "Where did they go?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "McAllister couldn't find 3 of them," Dawson said. "The other 8 settled, took whatever Hargrove offered and left the territory." "And the 3? He was quiet for a moment. "Unknown," he said. Emily set the letter down. She thought about her father, who had borrowed against his ranch and died of a heart that stopped in the night 2 weeks after Hargrove's men first came to the door. She had told herself it was the drought and the debt and 30 years of hard work finally coming due all at once. She was no longer entirely certain of that. "Dawson," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been thinking the same thing." She looked at him. He was looking at the map, not at her, but there was something in his jaw that told her he had been carrying this particular weight for longer than 2 weeks and had not yet found a way to put it down. "My father," she said. Not a question. "I don't know," he said. "And I'm not going to tell you I do." He finally looked at her. "But McAllister is looking at the timeline. The loan, the death, the speed at which Hargrove's men arrived after." A pause. "It may be nothing. Men do die of hearts that give out." "They do," Emily said. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the timing was very clean for something accidental. Emily folded the letter and slid it back across the table. Her hands were steady again. She had discovered something about herself in the past 11 days, that fear and grief, when they reached a certain size, stopped making her fall apart and started making her very, very quiet inside. Like everything non-essential shut off, and what remained was just the part of her that knew how to keep moving. "What do we do with this?" she asked. "We send it to a federal marshal," Dawson said. "Not Cord. A federal appointment out of Denver man named Haskell. McAllister has a contact." He tapped the second letter. "But we need more than pattern to get Haskell interested. Pattern suggests wrongdoing. Evidence compels action." "What kind of evidence?" "Hargrove's operation has a central ledger," he said. "Every acquisition, every payment to Cord, every arrangement with territorial judges. McAllister's source inside the operation says it exists, says it's kept in Hargrove's main office in Denver." He looked at her steadily. "If we can get that ledger, or even a verified copy of the relevant entries, Haskell can move on Hargrove directly, not just on the land claims, on everything." Emily looked at the map, at the line Dawson had drawn showing Hargrove's proposed railroad route, at the 17 properties along it, most of them now marked with small notations she recognized as Hargrove's name. "McAllister's source inside the operation," she said slowly. "Who is that?" "Hargrove's bookkeeper," Dawson said. "A woman named Clara Voss. She's been with him 6 years. Started figuring out what she was actually recording about 18 months ago." He paused. "She reached out to McAllister quietly. She's scared. She won't move without protection guaranteed on paper first." Emily thought about a woman sitting at a desk recording numbers that meant something she hadn't understood until too late, and then understanding, and then being trapped by the understanding. She thought about how that felt from the inside. "I want to talk to her," Emily said. Dawson looked at her. "She's in Denver. I know where she is. Emily." He said her name with the particular weight of a man about to say something he expected to be argued with. "Hargrove knows you're here now. If you go to Denver, Hargrove knows I'm here and that the legal approach has been filed," she said. "Which means he's going to move on the property directly, and soon, because court filings take time and direct pressure doesn't. If we're going to get ahead of that, we need Haskell moving on the criminal case, not just the land case. And Haskell needs Clara Voss." She held Dawson's gaze. "And Clara Voss needs someone to talk to who isn't a lawyer or a man." The silence lasted about 10 seconds. "I'll go with you," he said. "You can't," she said. "If you leave the valley, there's nothing standing between Hargrove's men and the property. You know that." Another silence, longer. "I don't like this," he said. She said. "Tell me anyway, can McAllister arrange a meeting with Voss?" He looked at her for a long moment with those storm-gray eyes, and she could see him working through it, running the angles, finding the place where the logic led, and not finding a way around it. "I'll write to him tonight," he said. Emily nodded. She reached across the table and picked up the second letter to read it herself because she was not going to Denver to talk to a frightened woman for a plan she only half understood. She read until the sun came up. 3 days passed in a state of loaded quiet that reminded Emily of the hour before a thunderstorm. Everything still, everything waiting. The air carrying a pressure that had no outlet yet. Dawson received his reply from McAllister on the second day. Clara Voss would meet. 2 days' time, a boarding house on the east side of Denver that McAllister used for sensitive correspondence. She would speak to Emily and Emily only. No lawyers, no men, no exceptions. On the third morning, a rider came to the valley. Not Hargrove's men, not Cord. A boy of about 14 on a blown horse carrying a folded note that he handed to Dawson with the relief of someone who had been told to deliver it fast and wanted very much to be done with the assignment. Dawson read it. His expression did not change, but Emily had been watching his expressions for 3 days and had learned to read the things that didn't change in them. "What is it?" she asked. He handed her the note. It was from Webb. Short, direct, written in the hand of a man who had learned long ago to say necessary things without ornamentation. "Cord has a new deputy. Arrived yesterday from Denver. Name of Pruitt. Not a lawman. Has the look of Hargrove's contractors. Cord is calling him a federal appointment, but there's no paperwork on it that I can find. Be careful. A.W." Emily read it twice. "Pruitt," she said. "I know that name," Dawson said. His voice had gone to a particular flatness that she was beginning to understand meant something that in other men would have been alarm. He was involved in one of McAllister's flagged properties, a ranch near Pueblo that went quiet 2 years ago. Emily looked at him. One of the 3 that McAllister couldn't account for. Yes, she folded the note carefully. "Then, they're not just filing legal challenges anymore," she said. "They're putting the kind of man in position who resolves things without filings. That's what it looks like. How long before he moves?" "Days," Dawson said. "Maybe less." Emily felt the pressure in the air shift. This was the thing that changed the calculation. Not Hargrove's lawyers or Cord's badges, but a man named Pruitt, who resolved things without paperwork, given legal cover by a corrupt marshal, and placed within riding distance of Bear Creek. "I need to leave for Denver today," she said. "Emily, if Pruitt moves on the valley before the federal case is initiated, none of the land filings matter," she said. "A man like that doesn't get stopped by paperwork. He gets stopped by the kind of authority that comes from a federal criminal investigation already in motion." She looked at Dawson directly. "I get Clara Voss's testimony to McAllister. McAllister gets it to Haskell. Haskell moves. That's the only play that takes Pruitt off the board before he acts." Dawson stood with this. She could see what it cost him, not the logic he'd already arrived at. The same logic she could tell that. What it cost him was something else. Something that was not yet named between them, and that she was not going to name first. "I'll be back in 4 days," she said. 5 at the outside. "Take my backup horse," he said. "She's faster than she looks, and she knows the low road to Denver better than any map." "All right, and take this." He went to the shelf and came back with a small envelope sealed. "If anything goes wrong in Denver, anything, you take that to the federal land office. Ask for a man named Garrett. He's Haskell's contact there. He'll know what to do." Emily took the envelope and tucked it inside her coat. Her mother's coat, which had carried her through 11 days of mountain running and still apparently had more work to do. Dawson. She said his name with the same intention she'd used the first time to make him look at her directly. He did. Don't let Pruitt maneuver you into something that puts you outside the law, she said. Whatever he does, whatever provocation he runs, stay inside the legal line. Because if you're the one who steps outside it, Hargrove wins, and everything we've filed means nothing. He looked at her for a moment. You sound like McAllister, he said. McAllister's smart, she said. Something moved behind his eyes. Come back in one piece, he said. Just that. Nothing around it. I intend to, she said. She rode out of Bear Creek Valley as the morning was still new, and she did not look back because looking back was a habit she was trying to break. Denver was three things Emily had forgotten: loud, crowded, and full of people who did not see her coming. That last part was an advantage she intended to use. McAllister's boarding house contact was a woman named Ruth, who ran the establishment with the particular no-nonsense authority of someone who had survived enough frontier life to be impressed by very little. She looked Emily over, once decided something, and showed her to a back room on the second floor without asking any questions. Clara Voss was already there. She was younger than Emily expected. Maybe 28, with the careful posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible over a long period of time, and eyes that moved to the door and back whenever a sound came from the hallway. She had a ledger book on the table in front of her, and both hands flat on top of it, like she was keeping it from escaping. You're Emily Cole, she said. Harper, Emily said out of instinct. Then, Cole, I keep forgetting. Something in Clara's face softened fractionally. I know what you're running from, she said. I looked into you after McAllister reached out. Then you know why I'm here, Emily said. She sat down across from Clara without ceremony. And I know why you're scared. So let's not pretend the situation is smaller than it is and talk about what you actually have. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she lifted both hands from the ledger and pushed it across the table. Emily opened it. She had expected financial records. Columns of numbers, property transactions, the dry architecture of fraud. What she found instead was a complete operational record: payments to Cord by name and date payments to 3 territorial judges, including amounts and case references. A list of properties with disposition notes that used language she had to read twice before she understood what it meant. Terms like resolved externally and matter closed without process next to property names. Next to one of the 3 names, McAllister hadn't been able to account for the note. Read J. Pringle Pueblo, final resolution via Pruitt. No further action required. Emily kept her face still. How long have you had this? She asked. I've been copying entries for 8 months, Clara said. A little at a time. When Hargrove was out, when Cord wasn't in the office. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. If he finds out I have this. He won't, Emily said. Not if we move today. She looked at Clara directly. Is there anything in here that connects Hargrove directly to Pruitt's activities, not just the payments? Something that shows Hargrove directed the outcomes personally? Clara reached into the front cover of the ledger and removed a single folded page. He wrote instructions, she said, in his own hand. I copied it 6 weeks ago when he left the page on his desk. She unfolded it and put it in front of Emily. He writes everything in his own hand. He doesn't trust it to anyone else. Emily read the page. It was short, 12 lines. Gerald Hargrove's handwriting precise and confident, directing Pruitt to secure the Cole property in Bear Creek Valley by any available means, and noting that the woman is no longer a legal complication, but her presence on the property may be used as a pretext for entry. Her presence on the property. As a pretext for entry. Emily sat with the page in her hands and understood what that meant. They hadn't given up on using her. They had simply changed how. Pruitt didn't need a debt claim. He needed an excuse to enter Dawson's land legally, and a woman of uncertain history and residence, a woman whose background could be characterized. However Cord chose to characterize, it was exactly that excuse. She had left to protect the valley, and by leaving, she had removed the only legal complication keeping Pruitt from fabricating a reason to ride in. She stood up so fast, the chair scraped. "I need McAllister right now," she said. "And I need him to contact Haskell tonight, not tomorrow, tonight." Clara stood too. "Emily, how fast can you get to McAllister's?" 20 minutes. "Go," Emily said. She was already at the door. "Take the ledger. Don't stop for anything." "Where are you going?" Emily was already in the hallway. She went down the stairs and through Ruth's front room and out into Denver's noise and heat and crowded streets, moving fast toward the stable where she'd left Dawson's horse, running the timeline in her head with the sick, precise clarity of someone who has just realized they made a mistake and is now calculating how much time they have to correct it. Hargrove's note was dated 6 weeks ago. Pruitt had arrived in Cutter's Bend 3 days ago. He had been given his cover as deputy 2 days ago. Webb's note had taken 1 day to reach the valley, which meant Pruitt had been operational for at minimum 2 days before they knew he existed, which meant that every hour she spent in Denver was an hour Pruitt had without her on that property. She got to the stable, saddled the horse with hands that moved faster than her thoughts, and was out of Denver at a pace that would have alarmed her under any other circumstances. She had told Dawson she'd be gone 4 days. She had been gone 1. She pushed the horse harder. She was 2 hours out of Denver on the high road that cut back toward the mountain range when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Too many for coincidence. Too close together for separate travelers. She didn't turn around. She looked for the next ridgeline and measured the distance. The hoofbeats got louder. She turned the horse off the road at the gap she'd noted cutting across open ground, where the footing was rougher, but the sight lines were longer, and looked back for the first time. 3 riders. Gaining. Not Pruitt's coloring she'd gotten a description from Webb's note. But they rode like men with a purpose, and their purpose was pointed at her. Emily thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pulled the sealed envelope from inside her coat. Dawson's envelope, the one he'd told her to open, only if something went wrong, and tucked it into the lining of her boot instead. If they caught her, whatever was on her person was what they'd find. What was in her boot might not be. She rode. The ridge came up fast. She took it without slowing, and on the other side was a creek crossing. She hadn't expected shallow but wide, and the horse didn't hesitate. She crossed and went left along the far bank where the ground was harder and left less track. By the time she reached the next stand of trees, the hoofbeats had slowed. They'd lost her line. She stopped in the trees and sat completely still listening while her heart did something loud and undisciplined that she chose to ignore. The hoofbeats searched for another minute. Then they moved away, back toward the road. Emily let out a breath. She sat in those trees for exactly as long as it took her hands to stop shaking. Then she straightened, checked her boot, and turned the horse toward Bear Creek. She thought about the 12 lines in Hargrove's handwriting. She thought about a man named J. Pringle in Pueblo, who had been finally resolved by Pruitt. She thought about her father and his heart that stopped in the night, and the men who had been at the door so fast afterward. She thought about Dawson alone in a valley with a man like Pruitt moving toward it. She didn't stop again until she could see the peaks above Bear Creek, and then she heard it, a single rifle shot, flat and distant, rolling down from the valley like a door slamming in a quiet house. She drove the horse forward at a full run. The rifle shot echoed off the peaks and died, and in the silence after it, Emily's whole body made a decision that her mind was still catching up to. She rode harder. The horse took the last grade into Bear Creek Valley at a pace that was probably reckless on that terrain, but Emily's hands were steady on the reins, and her eyes were already scanning the yard before they cleared the tree line. What she saw made her pull up hard enough that the horse protested with a sharp sideways step. The yard was full of men. Not 3 this time. 7, maybe 8, some on horseback, 2 already dismounted. Cord was there, his badge catching the afternoon light, with an officiousness that turned her stomach. And there, slightly apart from the others, was a man she had not seen before, but recognized immediately from the way everyone else in the yard kept a subtle distance from him. Pruitt. He was not physically remarkable. Medium height, middle age, the kind of face you'd forget in a crowd. But he stood with a particular stillness that reminded Emily of something. It took her a moment to identify the stillness of a thing that did not need to announce itself, because it had never once in its existence failed to be dangerous. He was looking at Dawson. Dawson was on the porch. He had his rifle. He had not raised it, but he was holding it in a way that communicated an entire conversation without a word. The way a man who has been a Union scout and has lived alone in a mountain valley for 8 years holds a weapon when he has decided exactly what he will and will not do. There was a body on the ground near the fence. Emily's heart seized. Then she saw it was not Dawson. The size was wrong, the coloring was wrong, and she sorted through the shock fast enough to recognize one of Hargrove's contractors face down in the dirt, with a wound in his shoulder that was bleeding but not apparently immediately fatal. He was still moving, still cursing actually, at a low and continuous volume. She understood the rifle shot she'd heard on the road. Someone had moved first. Dawson had answered. And now they were here this precise moment with everything balanced on the thinnest possible line between something that could still be walked back and something that could not. She made herself ride into the yard at a controlled pace, not running, not hesitating, the kind of pace that said she had every right to be here, which she did, which was the only card she had left to play. Every head in the yard turned. Cord's face went through something complicated and fast. Pruitt simply watched her approach with those forgettable eyes that forgot nothing. Dawson looked at her. Something crossed his face for just a fraction of a second, relief sharp and quickly suppressed, and then he was back to the particular stillness of a man managing a very loaded situation. "Mrs. Cole," Cord said. He had the practiced tone of a man performing legality. "You've saved us some time." "Marshal," she said. She kept her voice even. "I see you've brought company." "This is Deputy Pruitt," Cord said. "Federal appointment." "I know who he is," Emily said. She dismounted without hurrying and looped the reins on the post with the calm of someone who had not just ridden 2 hours at full pace after hearing a gunshot. "I also know there's no federal paperwork on that appointment because I spent this morning in Denver and made some inquiries." She looked at Cord directly. "Aldous Webb knows it too. He sent us a note." Something moved in Cord's face. Pruitt said nothing. He was still watching her with that still assessing patience. "We're here on a property matter," Cord said. "There are questions about the title filing made 2 days ago." "Those questions belong in federal court," Emily said. "Which you know because the filing was made to the Federal Land Office, which removes it from territorial jurisdiction." She reached into her coat. Her hands were not shaking. She was very deliberately making sure they were not shaking, and produced the copy of the federal filing that Dawson had given her the morning they rode to Webb's. "That's a sealed federal record. You're welcome to read the date on it." Cord didn't take it. Pruitt did. He looked at it for a long moment without any expression at all. Then he handed it back. "Filing dates can be challenged," he said. His voice was exactly what she'd expected. Quiet, without inflection, the voice of a man who said everything the same way, because tone was a vulnerability he'd eliminated. "On what grounds?" Emily said. "Fraud," he said. "The marriage this filing is attached to is of questionable legitimacy." "Questionable how?" "A woman with an outstanding debt obligation entering into a marriage contract may be acting under duress," Pruitt said, "which invalidates the contract, which invalidates the filing attached to it." Emily looked at him. She understood now fully and completely what she was dealing with. This was not a man who believed what he was saying. This was a man who knew exactly how far a false legal argument needed to travel to accomplish its purpose, not to win in court, but to create enough confusion, enough procedural noise, to allow other things to happen in the meantime. She had the ledger. Clara had the ledger on her way to McAllister. McAllister was supposed to be contacting Haskell tonight. Tonight was not now. Now was this yard with 7 armed men and Pruitt's quiet voice, and Cord's badge, and Dawson on the porch with a rifle he was not going to use first, because she had told him not to, and he was holding to that with the discipline of a man who understood exactly what it was costing him. She needed to buy time. "Then let's resolve the question of duress," she said. She turned toward Cord. Right now, in front of witnesses, I am stating clearly that I entered the marriage of my own will without coercion, and that I am stating it to the territorial marshal as a matter of legal record. She looked at him. You're a witness to that, Marshal. So are your men. She looked at Pruitt. So are you. If you challenge the court, you'll need to explain why the testimony of the woman herself isn't sufficient to resolve a duress claim. Pruitt looked at her. It's not your testimony that's in question, he said. It's the circumstance. Courts evaluate circumstance, not just declaration. Then let them evaluate it, she said. In federal court, where this filing already lives. The yard was very quiet. She could feel Dawson behind her, not moving, not speaking, trusting her to hold this line, and the weight of that trust was something she felt physically across her shoulders, like a hand steadying her. Cord looked at Pruitt. Something passed between them. Then Pruitt looked at the man bleeding by the fence. Your husband shot a duly deputized officer, he said. That's a criminal matter, not a civil one, and criminal matters don't wait on federal filings. There it was. The real play. Not the marriage, not the title. Dawson had fired in defense of his own property against men who'd entered without invitation, and Pruitt was going to use that single rifle shot to pull the entire situation out from under the federal protection the land filing provided. Emily spoke before she let herself think about what she was saying. He fired on a man who entered his property without a warrant and without consent, she said. That's legal defense of property under territorial law, and you know it. Unless your deputy's appointment carries a warrant? She looked at Cord. Is there a warrant for search or entry on this property? Cord opened his mouth. Because if there isn't, Emily said, then every man in this yard who came through that fence without one is trespassing on federally filed land. And that man on the ground got shot because he was trespassing. She held Cord's gaze. Do you have a warrant, Marshal? The silence stretched long enough that it answered the question. We'll be back with one, Cord said. When you have one. Dawson said from the porch, the first words he'd spoken since she'd ridden in, come back. Cord looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the yard, at Emily, at Dawson, at the rifle, at the federal filing still in Emily's hand. His face showed nothing, but he turned his horse. Get Kellner up, he said to the men near the fence. Two of them moved to pull the wounded man to his feet. He was stable enough to be angry about it, which Emily took as a reasonable sign. They left the yard in the same unhurried way that Hargrove had left it 2 days ago, and it bothered Emily the same way now as it had then. Not the departure, but the patience behind it. The sound of hoofbeats faded. Emily stood in the yard and did not move for a full 10 seconds. Then her legs told her something honest about the past 3 hours, and she put one hand on the fence post. Dawson was beside her before she finished the motion. Not touching her. Just there close enough that the steadiness of him was something she could feel. You came back early, he said. I heard a shot, she said. Kellner drew on me first, he said. I aimed low. I know. She straightened. I figured. You need to sit down. In a minute. She turned to look at him, and there was something she wanted to say that she didn't have language for, yet something about the weight of the past hour, about the way she'd held that line in the yard with her voice and a piece of paper while her heart was conducting its own separate and much louder conversation. Clara has the ledger, she said. She's taking it to McAllister right now. He contacts Haskell tonight. Dawson's eyes changed, just slightly. You got it. She had everything, Emily said. Cord's payments, the judges, Pruitt. She paused. A note in Hargrove's own handwriting ordering Pruitt to take this property by any available means. Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then tonight matters, he said. Tonight matters, she agreed. But Pruitt's going to come back with a warrant. Cord can manufacture one. It won't take long. How long do we need? If McAllister moves tonight, 12 hours. Maybe less if Haskell's already been briefed. Then we hold the valley for 12 hours, Dawson said. He said it the way he said most things, without theater, without inflation. Like 12 hours was a practical problem with a practical solution, and the emotion involved in it was neither here nor there. Emily looked at him. "They'll come at night," she said. "If Pruitt is what McAllister's file says he is, he won't wait for morning." "I know," Dawson said. "Come inside. I want to show you where I've positioned things." She followed him in. He had been preparing since the morning she left. She could see it in the cabin, in the way things had been reorganized with a quiet intention she recognized as the work of a man who was not panicking, but who was also not pretending that what was coming was anything other than what it was. The ammunition she'd asked him to show her on the second day was redistributed. 2 rifles positioned near windows with clear sight lines. A backup on the shelf by the rear door. "You knew they'd come before I got back," she said. "I suspected," he said. "Webb sent a second note yesterday. Pruitt was asking in Cutter's Bend about the road into the valley." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know they'd come in the afternoon. I expected night." "They came in the afternoon because I left," she said. "My being here was the legal complication. Without me on the property, Pruitt could characterize the situation however he wanted. With me gone, there was no one to contest it in the moment." "Then your coming back changed the calculation," he said. "For today," she said. "Tonight's different." "Tonight's different," he agreed. She picked up one of the rifles and checked it with the automatic competence of a ranch daughter who had learned guns the same way she'd learned everything else on her father's property, practically early and without sentiment. Dawson watched her do it. "Your father teach you?" he asked. "Before he taught me to read," she said. "He said literacy was important, but a coyote didn't care how well you could read." Something shifted in Dawson's expression, not the almost smile, something quieter. "He sounds like he was a practical man," he said. "He was." She set the rifle down. "I've been thinking about what McAllister's letter said, about the timeline." She didn't look up. "I don't know what happened to my father. I may never know. But I know what Hargrove is, and I know what men like Pruitt are paid to do, and I know that my father was standing between Hargrove and something he wanted." She finally looked at Dawson. "That's enough for me to know what this is." Dawson held her gaze. "What is it?" he asked, not challenging her, asking because he wanted to know what word she was going to use. "A reckoning," she said. "Long overdue." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." She nodded once. She picked up the rifle again and moved to the window to check the sight line and the distance to the tree line, measuring what she could see and what she couldn't. And Dawson moved to the other window and did the same. And for a while, they worked in a silence that had a different quality than any silence they'd shared before. Not careful, not cautious, not two strangers negotiating the terms of proximity. The silence of two people on the same side of something. Dalkek. Night came down fast, the way it did in high country, with the peaks cutting off the last light before the sky was fully ready to surrender it. They ate. Emily couldn't have said what. It was food, and it was hot, and Dawson had made it, and those were the things that mattered. At 9 o'clock, Dawson heard something she didn't. He was on his feet before she registered what had changed, moving to the window, with a speed that was quiet and unhurried, and also very fast in a way that shouldn't have been possible simultaneously. "How many?" she said. He held up a hand. "Listening." Then, 4 that I can hear. Probably more I can't." Emily moved to her window. The yard was dark. The moon wasn't up yet. "They're coming in from the north side," Dawson said. "Along the creek." "The creek's shallow there," Emily said. "They can cross without sound. That's why they're using it." She looked at him across the room. "Pruitt." "Has to be," he said. "Cord's men aren't this quiet." Emily felt the moment settle onto her, with a weight that was not panic. She had passed through the part of the night that belonged to panic about 2 hours ago, somewhere between supper and Dawson's first rifle check, and what was left on the other side of it was a clarity that was almost cold. "What do we do?" she said. Dawson looked at her. "You stay low, and you stay away from windows unless I say otherwise." He checked his rifle. "And you, Dawson." She stopped him. "I'm not staying low." He looked at her. "I can shoot," she said. "You know I can. And 2 rifles are better than 1, and you know that too." A pause. A very deliberate, very controlled pause, in which she could see him weighing things. "The south window," he said finally. "Anything that comes through the fence line on the south side is yours to call." "Agreed," she said. She moved to the south window. They waited. The waiting was the worst part. It was always the worst part. The mind during waiting had too much room to move, and it moved to all the places that didn't help, to the note in Hargrove's handwriting, to the names on McAllister's list, to her father's ranch, and the men at the door, and the careful, patient machinery of it all. She pulled herself back from that and focused on the fence line. 12 minutes passed. Then Dawson said very quietly, "Light." She looked. There was a light moving along the North Creek bank. Not a lantern, a torch. Just one. But it wasn't for illumination. It was moving toward the outbuilding. "They're going to fire the outbuilding," Dawson said. "Force us out." "Can they reach the cabin from there?" "No, but they don't need to reach the cabin. They need me out of it." He was already moving toward the rear door. "If I go out the back, you go out the back, and Pruitt has men waiting there," Emily said. "That's what the south approach is. Not an entrance. A trap." Dawson stopped. She saw it land. She watched him recalculate. "Stay inside," she said. "Let them fire it. The outbuilding isn't the valley. There are 3 horses in that outbuilding," he said. His voice was controlled, but she heard what was underneath it. Not fear for himself. Not calculation. Just the plain human reality of a man who had worked and lived alongside those animals. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." He was still for a moment. Then the torch hit the outbuilding wall, and the fire took, and there was noise now, not gunfire, but the horses coming out the far side where Dawson had apparently left the back panel open. She realized had left it open before sunset, because he'd planned for this possibility, even while he hoped against it. The horses ran clear, and in the yard lit now by the fire, 5 men emerged from the shadows. Pruitt was in the front. "Cole," he called. "Come out. We can resolve this." Dawson was at the window. He did not come out. "I'm going to say this once," Dawson said loud enough to carry. "You are on federally filed land. You have no warrant. Every action you take here tonight is a federal offense, and there is a record that will reflect it." Pruitt walked forward. "Records need someone to submit them," he said. "They've been submitted," Emily said from the window. Pruitt stopped. He looked at the window she was at. She could see his face in the firelight, that unreadable patient face, now doing something that took her a moment to identify as the closest it probably came to surprise. "The woman who took the Denver road this morning," he said. "The woman who spent this morning with a federal marshal's contact in Denver," Emily said, "and whose testimony and the documentation she provided is currently in the hands of Marshal Haskell's office." She held his gaze through the window glass. "Haskell knows your name, Mr. Pruitt. He knows the Pueblo property. He knows Jay Pringle." She watched his face. "He knows all of it." The yard went very still. One of Pruitt's men looked at another. That was the first crack, not in Pruitt, but in the men around him, the ones who were hired for this kind of work, but hired under the assumption that it would be resolved before it reached the kind of attention she was describing. "You're bluffing," Pruitt said. "Try me," Emily said. Another silence. Then from the road, hoofbeats. Fast, multiple. Every head in the yard turned. 4 riders came through the valley entrance at a pace that was urgent and official, and carried with it the particular authority of men who had been riding hard because they were late to something they needed to be on time for. The lead rider had a badge that caught the firelight. Not Cord's badge, a different badge. Federal configuration, different shape. Emily felt something break open in her chest. "Haskell's men," Dawson said, very quietly, almost to himself. She had told McAllister tonight. McAllister had moved faster than tonight. The federal riders came into the yard, and the lead man took in the scene. The burning outbuilding, Pruitt's crew, the rifles at the cabin windows, with the quick professional assessment of a man who had seen situations like this before and knew exactly how to read them. "Deputy Marshal Garrett," he said. "Federal Land Office." He looked at Pruitt. "Everybody put down what they're holding." Pruitt didn't move for a long moment. He was doing the same calculation Emily had watched him do in the yard that afternoon, running the angles, finding the place where the math led. But this time, the math was different. This time, there was a federal deputy in the yard, and a record in Haskell's office, and a woman at the window who had just named Jay Pringle out loud with witnesses present. Pruitt set down his rifle. His men followed. Garrett looked at the cabin. "Mrs. Cole," he called. "You all right in there?" Emily looked at Dawson. He was looking at her. In the firelight from the burning outbuilding, his face had an expression she had not seen on it before. Not the almost smile, not the controlled precision, not the steady patience she had come to understand as his default condition. Something open. Something that had not been there on the first morning or the second or any of the days in between. She turned back to the window. "We're all right," she called. She kept her voice steady. She kept her hands steady. But her heart was doing something loud and undisciplined that she was for once choosing not to quiet. Dawson crossed the room. He stood beside her at the window shoulder, almost touching hers, and looked out at the yard where Garrett's men were moving Pruitt and his crew to the fence posts with the organized efficiency of authority that had finally arrived in the right place at the right time. 12 hours, Dawson said. Less, Emily said. McAllister moved fast. Clara moved fast, she said. Give her the credit. A pause. Emily. He said her name the way she had learned to say his with intention to make her look. She did. You held this valley tonight, he said, with a piece of paper and a window and your voice. She looked at him. At this man she had known for 4 days, who had married her for legal reasons and shown her his maps and his letters and his ammunition stores and his plan and his trust, steadily and without theater, in the way that people who meant things did them rather than said them. We held it, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he opened the cabin door and walked out to meet Garrett, and Emily followed him out into the summer night, with the fire dying behind them, and the stars coming fully into their own above the peaks. And she thought that whatever came next, the court filings, the federal case, the long process of dismantling what Hargrove had built was going to be different from everything that had come before it, because she was not going to be running through it. She was going to be standing in it, right here, in this valley, beside this man. Deputy Marshal Garrett was a man who did his job without commentary, which Emily appreciated more than she could have said in that moment. He got Pruitt and his crew secured to the fence posts, posted 2 of his riders on the valley entrance, and came to the cabin porch with a calm that suggested this was not the most complicated yard he had walked into this year. He shook Dawson's hand. He tipped his hat to Emily. He accepted coffee because it was late and the ride had been long, and he sat at the table where Emily had eaten her first meal in 11 days and laid out what he knew. Haskell had received McAllister's contact at 4 in the afternoon. The ledger Clara Voss had provided, combined with the documentation McAllister already held, was enough for Haskell to authorize federal intervention on the Bear Creek property as a protected site under active federal review. Garrett had ridden with 3 deputies from Denver at a pace that explained the state of his horses and the set of his jaw. Pruitt will be taken to Denver, Garrett said. He'll be held pending federal charges. The Pueblo matter is already part of the file. He looked at his coffee cup. Cord is more complicated. His appointment is territorial, which means the federal jurisdiction only covers his actions in relation to the property matter. The rest goes to the territorial governor's office. Will the governor act? Dawson asked. Haskell has sent a letter, Garrett said. Which was not yes, but it was not no either, and in Emily's experience of the past several days, not no was the best available position from which to keep moving. And Hargrove? She asked. Garrett looked at her. That's the longer case, he said. The ledger gives us the framework. Hargrove's lawyers will challenge authentication chain of custody Clara Voss's credibility. He paused. It'll hold. McAllister is good, and Haskell is better. But it won't be fast. Emily nodded. She had known this. She had known it when she sat across from Clara in that boarding house room and watched the woman's hands shake on top of the ledger, that guidance was the beginning, not the end, and that what followed it was the long grinding work of making institutions do what they were supposed to do. How long? She asked. Federal prosecution on a land fraud case of this scope, Garrett considered. Year and a half before it's fully adjudicated. Could be less if Hargrove decides to negotiate rather than fight. He won't negotiate, Dawson said. He's not built that way. No, Garrett agreed. He isn't. He finished his coffee, set the cup down with the consideration of a man who had been raised to be careful with other people's things. The property protection order is in effect as of tonight. Anyone who comes onto this land without federal authorization while the review is active is in contempt. That includes Cord. He looked at Dawson. You're protected. For now, and for however long this takes. Dawson offered his hand again. Garrett shook it. He looked at Emily once more before he went to the door. Mrs. Cole, he said. That thing you said to Pruitt about Haskell's office about J. Pringle. He paused. We didn't have Pringle's name yet. That gave us a thread to pull. He held her gaze for just a moment. It mattered. He walked out. Emily sat with that for a while, after the door closed. The outbuilding burned down to nothing by midnight. There was nothing to be done about it, and Dawson did not try to do anything about it, which was its own kind of discipline. He stood and watched it go with his arms at his sides, and Emily stood beside him and watched it too, and neither of them spoke, because some things don't need commentary, and some losses are just losses. And the only honest thing is to stand there and let them be what they are. When it was fully down, he said, I'll rebuild it before fall. I know you will, she said. They went inside. Emily expected sleep to hit her the way it had on the first night, absolute, and consuming the body, shutting down everything non-essential. Instead, she sat at the table and found herself more awake than she'd been all day, the way sometimes happened after a long tension released, like the body needed a few hours to understand that the emergency was actually over. Dawson sat across from her. He poured 2 small glasses of something from a bottle on the shelf. He set one in front of her. She looked at it. What is that? Whiskey, he said. It's not very good. She picked it up. What are we drinking to? He looked at his glass for a moment. Then he said, to the valley still being here in the morning. She touched her glass to his. They drank. He was right that it wasn't very good. She didn't mind. Garrett said a year, she said. Year and a half. Could be, he said. She looked at the table, at the map that was still spread across one end of it, the annotated hand-drawn record of 8 years of watching and calculating and holding ground. That's a long time, she said. It is, he said. For a legal arrangement. The words came out more directly than she'd planned. She felt them land in the air between them and could not take them back, and also, she discovered, did not want to. She looked up at him. Dawson was looking at her with that expression she had seen in the firelight during Garrett's arrival, that open, unguarded thing that was so different from his usual careful containment that it still stopped her a little each time she caught it. Emily, he said. I know what the agreement was, she said. I know what I signed at Webb's office, and I know the conditions I put on it, and I know you agreed to every one of them without hesitation. She kept her voice level. I'm not trying to renegotiate. What are you trying to do? He asked. She looked at him. I'm trying to figure out what this is, she said. What it's become. Because I came here 11 days ago with nothing, and I was going to leave as soon as it was safe to leave, and that was the whole plan, and somewhere in the middle of maps and letters, and a rifle shot, and a burning outbuilding. She stopped, steadied. I don't know when the plan changed. Dawson was quiet for a long moment. The plan didn't change, he said. Not for me. She stared at him. "I told you the night you agreed," he said. "I said the loft was yours. Your space, your choice, dissolve it when the threat was settled if you wanted." He looked at her directly. "That's still true. Every word of it." He paused. "But I also told you that you weren't just paper in this. I meant that too." "What did you mean by it?" He turned the whiskey glass slowly in his hands. "I mean that I watched you ride into that yard today when you could have stayed on the road," he said. "I mean that I watched you stand in front of Pruitt with a federal filing and your voice and nothing else and hold the legal line I needed held." He set the glass down. "I mean that I have been in this valley 8 years, and I have been alone in it for all 8 of those years, and I have been fine with that, completely fine until 4 days ago." Emily sat very still. "4 days," she said. "4 days," he said, "which I understand is not very long." "It isn't," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I've also been a scout, and I know what it means to read terrain fast, to take in a situation, and understand it at a pace that other people find uncomfortable." He looked at her steadily. "I read you at that pace, Emily. From the first morning. I wasn't trying to. It just happened." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about her father, who had loved her mother in the direct and uncomplicated way of practical people, not with grand gestures or elaborate language, but with consistent presence and steady action, day after day, year after year, until the presence itself became the whole meaning of the word. She thought about a man who had watched her cross his property and steal from him and chosen to feed her instead of punish her, who had married her with a legal argument and shown her his maps and filed his paperwork and trusted her with his ammunition and his strategy and his valley, who had let her stand at the window last night instead of keeping her back and safe because she had said she wasn't staying low and he had heard her. "I have conditions," she said. Again. The same words she'd used at the table 4 days ago. Something moved in his eyes. "All right," he said. "New ones," she said. "I'm listening." "The loft stays mine until I decide it doesn't," she said. "And that decision is mine. Not mine under pressure, not mine because Hargrove or Cord or anyone else makes the alternative worse. Mine because I choose it." "Agreed," he said. Same word, same speed, same way he'd agreed 4 days ago. "And I want it on the record," she said, "that whatever this becomes, I came to it of my own will. Nobody chased me into it, and nobody trapped me in it, and nobody convinced me into something I didn't see clearly." "Noted," he said, and the word came back to her like an echo. She had used it standing on the bottom rung of the loft ladder on the first night when he had told her she wasn't just paper in this, and she hadn't known what to do with that yet. She knew now. "All right," she said. She picked up her glass. He picked up his. They drank the rest of the bad whiskey, and it was quiet, and the fire was out, and the valley was still there, and Emily Harper. Emily Cole sat at a table in the Colorado high country and felt for the first time since March that the ground under her was solid all the way down. Maud. The weeks that followed were not simple. She had not expected simple. Cord rode to the valley entrance twice in the first week, with different men and different pretexts, and was turned back both times by Garrett's deputies, who had established a rotation on the road that was for the moment holding. The territorial governor's response to Haskell's letter arrived at the end of the first week, cautious political, not a full rebuke of Cord, but an instruction to remove Pruitt's deputy appointment from the record, and a note that the matter was under review. It was less than enough, and more than nothing. Clara Voss left Denver under McAllister's arrangement, relocated to a town in Kansas, where Hargrove's network had no footprint, and sent a deposition that McAllister called the clearest piece of documentary evidence he had seen in 20 years of practice. Emily read the deposition when it arrived and thought about the woman shaking hands on that ledger and felt something fierce and protective on her behalf. She wrote Clara a letter. She wasn't sure it would reach her. She sent it anyway. Dawson rebuilt the outbuilding in 9 days. She helped him, which he hadn't asked for and didn't argue against. They worked in the practical companionship she was coming to understand as the primary language of this place, not filling silence for its own sake, not performing connection, just doing the work that needed doing in proximity to each other and finding that the proximity itself said what words would have said worse. On the 10th day after Garrett's arrival, a writer came from McAllister. Dawson read the letter at the table while Emily was washing the breakfast dishes. She heard his chair move and turned. His face had the expression she had learned to read as the one that preceded important information, that particular, like a man holding something steady before setting it down carefully. "Hargrove's been taken in for questioning," he said, "in Denver. Federal marshals went to his offices this morning." Emily set down the dish she was holding. "For questioning or for arrest?" "Questioning for now," he said. "But McAllister says Haskell has enough for charges. He's building the formal case before he moves. He wants it airtight." She nodded slowly. "Hargrove will have lawyers there within the hour." "He will," Dawson said, "but the questioning is on record. His presence in the federal office is on record." He looked at her. "That's the beginning of the end of it, Emily. It doesn't look like it yet, but that's what it is." She sat down across from him. She thought about what Garrett had said year and a half. The long grinding work of institutions. "My father's ranch," she said. "If Hargrove is charged federally, if the acquisition pattern is part of the case, what happens to the properties he took?" Dawson looked at the table. "That depends on how the federal court handles it," he said carefully. "In some cases, fraudulently acquired property reverts to the original holder or their heirs. In others, it gets absorbed into the case as evidence of damages." He paused. "McAllister is already documenting your father's property as part of the acquisition pattern. He flagged it in the first letter. If the case goes the way it should, there may be a claim." Emily sat with this. The ranch outside Denver. Her father's 30 years of work. The thing she had run from because there was no way to hold it, and every way to lose it, and now the dim, dangerous possibility of something she had stopped letting herself want. "Don't hope for it," she said, to herself as much as to Dawson. "No," he agreed. "But don't rule it out either." She looked at him. "You'd tell me to go back," she said. "If the claim came through, you'd tell me to go back and take it." He held her gaze. "I'd tell you it was your choice," he said, "same as I've told you everything. And if I chose to go back..." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'd help you get it in order," he said. "And I'd ask if you needed someone who knew water rights and land filings." He paused. "And I'd ride to Denver as often as the valley could spare me." Emily looked at him. She thought about the ranch. About 30 years of her father's life worked into that ground. She thought about Denver and what it had been before March, and what it was now, a city where Hargrove's men had come to her door, and where she had run from, and where Clara Voss had sat with a ledger in her shaking hands. She thought about Bear Creek, about a loft that smelled like cedar, about maps on a table and letters written by lamplight, and a man who cooked eggs without asking for thanks, and agreed to conditions without argument, and stood on a porch with a rifle in a yard full of men without flinching. "Ask me again when the claim comes through," she said. "If it comes through." "All right," he said. They both knew what the answer was going to be. Neither of them said it yet because there was time, and because some things are better arrived at than announced. 6 weeks after Garrett's night ride into Bear Creek Cord was removed from his position as territorial marshal by order of the governor's office. The removal letter cited irregularities in appointment practices and pending federal review of decisions made during his tenure. It did not say what everyone who read it understood it to mean. Emily heard about it from Webb, who rode to the valley himself to deliver the news with the particular satisfaction of a man who had watched something wrong persist for too long and had finally seen it corrected. "He's gone to Kansas," Webb said at the porch. "Or that's the word. Took his horse and left before anyone could formally serve him with the federal subpoena." "He'll be found," Dawson said. "Haskell's people are already looking," Webb said. He looked at Emily. "There's something else." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Came to my office addressed to you, from McAllister's office in Denver." Emily took it. She opened it standing on the porch. It was a formal letter. Legal language precise and dense, the kind she had learned in the past weeks to read past the surface of, to find what it actually said. What it actually said was this. The federal court had issued a preliminary order freezing all of Hargrove's property acquisitions made in the past 4 years, pending resolution of the criminal case. The Harper Ranch outside Denver was included in the freeze. As the sole legal heir to the original property holder, Emily's claim to the ranch was formally recognized as pending. McAllister was requesting her authorization to file on her behalf. She read it twice. Then she handed it to Dawson. He read it. He handed it back. He did not say anything because he understood her well enough by now to know that she needed a moment and would speak when she was ready. Webb looked between them. "Good news?" he asked. "Yes," Emily said. Her voice was steady. "It's good news." Webb nodded. He tipped his hat. He rode back toward Cutter's Bend, with the dignified haste of a man who understood he was not needed for what came next. Emily stood on the porch with the letter in her hand. Dawson was beside her. "So," he said. "So," she said. A pause. "You could go back," he said. "File the claim in person. It would move faster with you there." "I know," she said. "McAllister would handle it well regardless. But your presence—" "Dawson." She said his name. He stopped. She turned to look at him directly. "My father built that ranch over 30 years, she said. "He loved it more than almost anything. And I love it too. I love what it was, what he made it, what it meant." She held his gaze. "But my father worked himself into the ground on that ranch alone because he was too proud to say when he needed someone beside him. He carried everything by himself because he thought that was what strength looked like." She paused. "I watched him do that my whole life. And I promised myself a long time ago that I was not going to make the same mistake." Dawson looked at her. "What are you saying?" he asked, very quietly. "I'm saying the ranch can be managed," she said. "Least worked by someone trustworthy held in the family name. It doesn't need me standing on it every day to be mine." She looked at the valley around her, at the creek. She could hear from the porch at the peaks above it, at the outbuilding Dawson had rebuilt with his own hands in 9 days, while she handed him boards, and neither of them had made anything of the fact that she'd stayed to help. "This is where I want to stand," she said. "This valley, this ground." A beat. "Beside you." Dawson was very still. "The conditions," he said. "The ones you set at Webb's office." "I want to change them," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The summer light was full on the valley, and it was warm, and the creek was audible, and somewhere on the near ridge, one of the horses, the ones that had run clear of the outbuilding and come back the next morning as if nothing particular had happened, made a sound that carried down to the porch. "Change them how?" he asked. "The loft," she said. "I'm done with the loft." Something happened in Dawson Cole's face that she had not seen in 5 weeks of watching his face with the attention of someone learning a new language. It was not the almost smile. It was not the open flicker she'd caught in the firelight. It was something larger than either of those things, something that started in his eyes and moved through the whole of him, the way water moves through ground that has been dry too long. "Emily," he said. "I'm not running anymore," she said. "I'm not negotiating from a position of survival. I'm choosing this with my full mind in full daylight with nothing threatening me and nowhere I have to be." She held his gaze. "I'm choosing you. That's what I'm saying." He stepped toward her. He raised one hand and touched the side of her face with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything. Nothing rushed. Nothing wasted. Nothing that didn't mean exactly what it was. "I've been waiting for you to say that," he said. "Since the second day, maybe. I didn't want to push." "I know you didn't," she said. "That's part of why I'm saying it." He looked at her for one more moment, this man who had fed her and married her and shown her his maps and his trust and his valley, who had stood between her and every threat that came, and who had never once suggested she owed him anything for it, and then he pulled her in. She let herself be pulled. She pressed her face against the solid warmth of his chest and felt his arms close around her with the same steady certainty with which he did everything. And she stood there on the porch of a cabin in a Bear Creek Valley in the Colorado high country in the middle of summer, and felt the ground under her feet as clearly as she had ever felt anything in her life. Solid, unshaking, entirely hers. The federal case against Gerald Hargrove took 14 months. He did not negotiate. Dawson had been right about that. He fought every piece of it with every lawyer he could afford, and he could afford many, and the process was exactly as long and grinding as Garrett had warned it would be. Clara Voss testified in federal court in Denver in the spring of the following year. Emily sat in that courtroom for every day of it in the third row, and watched Clara speak in a clear, steady voice that showed no evidence of the shaking hands Emily had seen in that boarding house room. She was proud of her. She told her so after. Hargrove was convicted on 11 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit property crimes, and 1 count that related to J. Pringle of Pueblo that was listed in the formal record under language that was careful and precise and meant murder without using the word. He was sentenced in August. Cord was found in Kansas in February of the same year. His federal case moved faster because he had less money for lawyers and more reasons to negotiate. He negotiated. The terms were not generous. Pruitt was convicted before either of them in a separate proceeding, and Emily did not attend that one. She did not need to. The Harper Ranch outside Denver was formally returned to Emily's ownership 6 weeks after Hargrove's conviction. She rode there once with Dawson to walk the ground and see what it was now and make the decisions that needed making. She stood in front of the house her father had built, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken, and what had been recovered, and what could never be recovered, and she cried finally completely the way she had refused to cry since March of the previous year, because she had not been able to afford it. Dawson stood beside her and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and he had understood that from the beginning. She arranged a lease with a family she trusted. Good people who would work the land the way her father had worked it, with care, with patience, with respect for what the ground could give if you didn't take too much. On the last evening before they rode back to Bear Creek, she stood in the doorway of the house and looked at the space where her father's coat hook had been the one she had grabbed her mother's coat from on the night she ran, and she said a quiet goodbye to the man who had built this place and loved it, and tried to carry everything alone until he couldn't. She said it out loud. She didn't care if Dawson heard. He heard. He said nothing, but when she turned away from the door, he was right there. They rode back to Bear Creek the next morning. She was not running from anything. She was not running to anything. She was simply going home to a valley and a creek and a rebuilt outbuilding and a table with a map on it and a man who had agreed to her conditions and kept every word of it and loved her in the only way that had ever meant anything to her, which was steadily, consistently, and without reservation. She rode into the valley at midday, with the summer light full and the creek running clear, and the peaks above it holding the sky up the way they had held it every day for longer than anyone could measure. Dawson rode beside her. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Emily Harper had come to this valley with 3 stolen eggs and nothing else, and she had found something no legal document could grant, and no corrupt marshal could take, and no patient, expensive man in a good suit could ever engineer away from her. She had found solid ground, and she had chosen it with her whole heart, and she was never going to run again.